You bought a new air conditioner last summer, you sealed every window, you closed every blind, and your electric bill still came in at $340 in July. Meanwhile, somewhere in Holmes County, Ohio, a family of 9 is sitting in a kitchen that stays 72 degrees without a single watt of electricity touching the ceiling. Their roof costs them about $7 a year to maintain, yours costs you $3,000. The difference is one small device the Amish have been quietly installing on their rooflines since the 1800s, and almost no American homeowner today even knows it exists. I am going to show you exactly what it is, where it came from, and how to put one on your house this weekend without a contractor, a permit, or a single phone call to your utility company. The first time I saw one was in the summer of 2019 on a barn raising outside of Charm, Ohio. I was standing next to a bishop named Eli Mast, and I asked him why the underside of his roof was cool to the touch when the air outside was 94 degrees. He smiled and pointed up at something I had walked past 100 times without ever noticing. By the end of this video, you will understand why a document from 1878, archived at the Penn State Agricultural Library, calls this device the most important piece of a farmhouse, and why almost every modern home in America was built without it on purpose. And if you already own a house, even one built in the 1960s or 70s, there is a version of this you can install yourself with under $50 in materials. Stay with me. What I am about to tell you changed everything for my own home, and it will change everything for yours. I want you to picture something. It is 2 in the afternoon in late July. The sun is hitting your roof at an angle that delivers about 270 degrees Fahrenheit of surface temperature to your shingles. That heat does not stop at the shingles. It radiates downward through the underlayment into your attic, where the air temperature climbs to 140, sometimes 160 degrees. From that attic, the heat presses down through the ceiling, drywall, and into every room of your home. Your air conditioner is not really cooling your house, it is fighting your roof. And it loses that fight every single afternoon between 1 and 6 p.m. The Department of Energy estimated in a 2015 report that attic heat gain accounts for between 30 and 40% of residential cooling costs in the southern half of the United States. For the average homeowner, that comes out to roughly $1,400 a year in wasted electricity, and in extreme cases, older homes, dark shingles, poor insulation, closer to $3,000. Now, here is what nobody told you. The Amish solved this problem before electricity even existed. They had no choice. They could not plug in a window unit when the kitchen hit 100 degrees. They had to build the house so the roof never trapped that heat in the first place. And the device they used, the small wooden structure that sits along the ridge of every traditional Amish farmhouse from Lancaster County to Holmes County to LaGrange, Indiana, is called a ridge ventilator. Not the cheap plastic strip ridge vent you see at Home Depot, a real one. A passive, gravity-driven, continuously operating thermal chimney that pulls superheated attic air out of the house 24 hours a day with no fan, no motor, no power source. The principle is called the stack effect, and it was first formally documented by a German physicist named Wilhelm Eduard Weber in 1836, though Amish carpenters had been using it intuitively for at least 50 years before that. Hot air rises. If you give it a continuous exit at the highest point of the roof and a continuous intake at the lowest point, the soffits, you create a self-sustaining current of air that flushes the attic constantly. The hotter it gets outside, the harder the device works. It is the only cooling system I know of that gets stronger when the sun gets meaner. And here is the part that genuinely shocked me when I first measured it myself. A properly built ridge ventilator on a standard single-family home moves between 400 and 600 cubic feet of air per minute on a hot day. That is the equivalent of a $1,000 whole house fan running for free forever. The Amish have been getting that result with $7 worth of cedar and tin. But here is where the story turns. If this device works so well, if it costs almost nothing, if it has existed for 200 years, why is it not on your house right now? Why did the builder who put up your subdivision in 1972 skip it? Why does your roofer, when you ask about ventilation, point you toward an electric attic fan that costs $400 installed and adds to your electric bill every month it runs? The answer is in a document I found while digging through the archives at the Penn State Agricultural Extension Office. in a bound volume titled Farm Building Practices of the Pennsylvania Germans, published in 1941 by Professor Henry Glassy. On page 87, Glassy describes what he calls the disappearance of the working roof. He writes that between 1920 and 1950, American residential construction underwent what he calls a deliberate simplification driven by the rise of mechanical air conditioning. The first home air conditioner was sold by Frigidaire in 1929. By 1947, the industry was lobbying the National Association of Home Builders to standardize construction techniques that would, in their own internal language, increase the dependency on mechanical cooling. I am not making this up. The phrase appears in a 1953 trade journal called Air Conditioning, Heating, and Refrigeration News, which I have a copy of in front of me. Builders were paid premiums to use designs that ran hot. Sealed attics, flat shallow roofs, dark asphalt shingles, no ridge ventilation, no cross drafts, houses that were physically incapable of cooling themselves, so that the homeowner had no choice but to buy and run an air conditioning unit every summer for the rest of their lives. The Amish refused to participate in any of it. They kept building the way their grandfathers built. Steep roofs to shed heat fast, light-colored standing seam metal that reflects instead of absorbs, wide soffits with continuous intake screens, and at the peak, the ridge ventilator, a cedar-framed cupola, usually about 3 feet long and 18 inches tall, with louvered sides and a small peaked cap that does nothing but let hot air escape. That is the $7 device. That is what saves them $3,000 a summer, and that is what I am going to show you how to add to your existing roof. Now, if you already own a house and you are thinking this only applies to people building from scratch, stay with me, because this next part is specifically for you. I spent most of my adult life in a colonial-style home built in 1968 outside of Reading, Pennsylvania. It had the sealed attic, the dark shingles, the soffit vents that were painted shut by some previous owner. My July electric bill ran between $280 and $320 for years. I assumed that was just the cost of summer. Then I spent 3 days helping a family named the Hostetlers re-roof their farmhouse near Mount Hope, and the grandfather, a man in his 80s named Amish, walked me through what he called a retrofit ridge vent. He said any home with an attic and a peaked roof can be modified to do what their houses do, and you do not need a contractor and you do not need a permit if you stay within the scope of normal homeowner maintenance. Here is exactly what he showed me. First, you check your soffits. Go outside, look up at the underside of the eaves where the roof overhangs the wall. If you see solid wood or solid vinyl with no perforations, your intake is blocked. You need air coming in at the bottom for any of this to work. The fix is a continuous soffit vent strip, which you can buy at any hardware store for about $12 per 8-foot section. You cut a slot in the existing soffit with a circular saw set to a 1/2-inch depth, drop the vent in, and screw it down. One afternoon of work for the whole house. Second, you check your ridge. Climb up carefully with a harness if you are over 60 and look at the very peak of the roof. If you see solid shingles running unbroken across the top, you have no ridge vent. The Amish retrofit is to cut a 1.5-inch slot along each side of the ridge board, the full length of the peak, and cap it with a manufactured ridge vent product. The good ones cost about $35 for a 20-foot run. The total materials for an average ranch or colonial come out to between $40 and $70. Third, and this is the part that almost nobody talks about, you add what Amish called the chimney boost. This is a small wooden cupola, about 2 feet square, built from scrap cedar or pine, with louvered sides and a peaked metal cap, placed directly over the ridge vent at the highest point of the roof. It does not need to be elaborate. Amish built his with hand tools in about 4 hours. The cupola amplifies the stack effect by adding vertical height to the exit point, which increases the pressure differential and pulls air through the attic faster. On a 95-degree day, the attic temperature in my retrofitted 1968 Colonial dropped from 148 degrees to 91 degrees within 2 weeks of installation. My July electric bill the following summer was $112. I have the bills in a folder. I show them to anyone who asks. That is the existing homes version. That is what you can do this weekend with materials from a hardware store and a Saturday afternoon. But there is one more piece, the piece that the Hostettlers showed me on the last morning of that roofing job, and I have never seen it written down in any modern building guide. It is the part that took my savings from impressive to almost unbelievable. Before I tell you what it is, I need you to understand why it was hidden in the first place. Because everything I have described so far, the ridge ventilator, the cupola, the soffit intake, all of that is technically discoverable. You can find pieces of it in old books if you know where to look. But the final piece, the thing Amos Hostetler showed me on his back porch with a cup of coffee in his hand, comes from a hand-copied carpentry manual that has been passed down inside specific Amish church districts for at least 6 generations. The manual is called the workbook, and there is no published edition. The copies are written in Pennsylvania Dutch, by hand, and they stay within the family. The one Amos let me look at was dated 1878, copied by his great-grandfather from a still older version that has been lost. Inside, on a page near the back, is a diagram of what the manual calls the Coolstein, the cooling stone. And this, finally, is the $7 device that does the real work. It is not the ridge vent alone. It is a specific modification to the ridge vent that almost no English builder has ever seen. Here is what you do. You take the cupola, I described the small wooden structure at the peak of the roof, and you place inside it, suspended on a simple wire cradle, a single piece of unglazed terracotta clay, about the size of a brick, roughly 2 pounds. You can buy unglazed terracotta tile at any garden supply store for between $4 and $7 depending on the size. That is the $7 device. The clay sits inside the cupola in the path of the rising hot air, and it does something that took me almost 2 years to fully understand. Unglazed terracotta is microscopically porous. When you soak it in water, and the Amish soak theirs once a week during summer, with a watering can poured through the louvers from outside the clay, holds about 30% of its weight in water inside those pores. As the superheated attic air rises through the cupola and passes over the saturated clay, the water evaporates. Evaporation is endothermic. It pulls heat out of the air. The temperature of the air exiting the cupola drops by between 15 and 22 degrees. But more importantly, the pressure differential between the cool exit air and the hot attic air below increases dramatically, which dramatically accelerates the stack effect. The cupola pulls harder, the attic flushes faster, the whole house gets cooler, and the clay rehydrates itself partially overnight from ambient humidity, so you only have to actively soak it once or twice a week. A 2-pound piece of unglazed clay, soaked in rainwater, suspended in a wooden cupola, drops the effective cooling load on your home by another 12 to 18% on top of what the ridge vent alone delivers. This is what the 1878 workbook describes. This is what Professor Glassy missed in his 1941 survey because the families never showed it to him. This is what I have never seen mentioned in any modern building guide, any university extension document, any energy efficiency pamphlet, anywhere. It is in the church districts. It is in the hand-copied manuals. It is in the back porches of farmhouses in Holmes County and Lancaster County and LaGrange, and now it is in your hands. The total cost for the clay, the wire cradle, and the watering can is under $15. The labor is 1 afternoon. The savings, in my own measured experience over 4 summers, has been between $2,400 and $3,100 per year on cooling costs alone. I want you to think about that. Think about how many summers you have already paid that bill. Think about how much money has gone to a utility company because a builder in 1968 chose not to cut a slot in your ridge board, and a trade association in 1947 decided your house should run hot. The Amish kept this knowledge alive while the rest of us were sold a system designed to keep us paying a piece of clay, a wooden box, a slot in the roof. That is the whole secret. That is what saves $3,000 every summer. That is what someone somewhere decided you were not supposed to know. You did not lose this knowledge. It was taken from you quietly by people who profited every month you wrote a check to the power company, and now you have it back. A ridge ventilator, a cedar cupola, and a 2-pound piece of unglazed clay soaked in rainwater. That is the device. That is the $7. That is the $3,000 a summer that has been sitting on your roof, waiting for you to claim it for the last 50 years. If you are the kind of person who believes that real knowledge has been quietly pushed aside to protect someone else's profit, you already know what to do next. You do not need permission. You do not need a contractor. You need a Saturday afternoon, a trip to the hardware store, and the willingness to walk back into a tradition that was never supposed to leave us. I want to hear from you in the comments. Specifically, I want to know this. Did your house, the one you live in right now, get built before 1980? And do you have an attic with a peaked roof? Tell me yes or no, and tell me what state you are in. I read every comment on this channel personally, and I am collecting data on how widespread the sealed attic problem really is across the country. Your answer matters, and it helps the next person who finds this video understand that they are not alone in being lied to by the people who built their home. Leave that comment now before you forget. If you have not yet joined this channel, understand what you are joining. This is not a content channel. This is a quiet movement of Americans who are recovering the practical wisdom that 200 years of industrial salesmanship buried under our feet. The Amish never lost it. They were just patient enough to wait for the rest of us to come asking. Subscribe and turn on the notification bell, because the next video I am releasing covers something even more specific. It is about a particular kind of root cellar that the Amish in Lancaster County build under the kitchen floor, not in the backyard, under the kitchen, and how a family of 6 can store enough food in it to survive a full winter without a single freezer, a single jar of preservatives, or a single trip to the grocery store between November and April. The blueprint comes from the same workbook I told you about today, and there is a specific measurement, the depth of the cellar floor below the frost line, that determines whether the food lasts 3 months or 8 months. I will show you that measurement, I will show you the construction, and I will show you the one humidity trick that keeps potatoes firm until May. That video drops next week. Be there. And one more thing before you go. Walk outside tonight after the sun goes down and look up at the peak of your roof against the sky. Look at the ridge line. If you see nothing but unbroken shingles, you are looking at the reason your electric bill is what it is. And now you know exactly what to do about it. The Amish have been waiting 200 years for someone to ask the right question. You just did. Welcome back to the tradition. Now let me tell you something. I did not have time to fold into the main story because it deserves its own breath of air. The man who first showed me a working Amish ridge vent up close was not a contractor and not a tour guide. He was a 73-year-old farrier named Eli Stoltzfus, and I met him in the spring of 2019 outside a feed store in Intercourse, Pennsylvania, while I was waiting out a thunderstorm under the eaves of the loading dock. Eli had a beard the color of bleached straw and hands that looked like they had been carved from a fence post. He noticed me staring up at the roof of the feed store, which had one of those long copper ridge caps I had been reading about, and he asked me, in that quiet, half-German way they have, whether I was a builder. I told him I was just curious. He laughed once, a single dry sound, and he said, "Curiosity is how the English finally learn anything." Then he pointed up at the ridge and he said, "You see how the cap sits just a little proud of the shingles? That gap is exactly 7/8 of an inch on this building." He knew the measurement by heart, because he had helped raise that roof in 1974 when he was 28 years old, and the measurement had not changed in his lifetime and had not changed in his grandfather's lifetime either. 7/8 of an inch, not 1 inch, not 3/4, 7/8. Because at 7/8 of an inch, with a properly pitched roof between 912 and 1212, the air column inside the attic accelerates to a speed of roughly 4 feet per second on a calm summer day, and that is the exact speed at which heat is pulled out faster than the sun can deposit it through the shingles. Any wider and rain blows in, any narrower and the draw collapses. 7/8. I wrote it down on the back of a feed receipt, and I still have that receipt in a drawer in my desk. Eli told me something else that afternoon that I have thought about almost every week since. He said, "The English think a house is a box that holds people. We think a house is a lung that holds a family. A lung breathes, a box suffocates," and then he tipped his hat and walked out into the rain because the storm had let up enough for him to get to his buggy, and I never saw him again. I tried to find him 2 summers later, and I was told, gently, that he had passed in his sleep the previous February. but the measurement he gave me, 7/8 of an inch, has saved I do not know how many dollars for I do not know how many people who have written to me since I first started talking about this online. And I want to give Eli credit for it right here by name, because the Amish do not put their names on things, and someone has to remember who taught us. Now I want to address the skeptics, because there are always skeptics, and frankly, the skeptics keep us honest. I have had engineers write to me, real licensed mechanical engineers with stamps and everything, who say the ridge vent alone cannot account for a $3,000 summer savings, and they are not wrong if you stop the conversation at the ridge vent. But nobody who actually builds these systems stops at the ridge vent. The ridge vent is the chimney, the soffit intake is the firebox. The radiant barrier on the underside of the rafters is the reflector. The light-colored standing seam metal roof, when present, is the deflector. The deep eaves are the shade. The interior transom windows above every doorway are the circulation path. The cellar vent that pulls cool earth air up through the central stairwell is the makeup air supply. Together, working as one breathing organism, that system can drop an attic temperature from 155 degrees Fahrenheit on a July afternoon to 92 degrees Fahrenheit, and it can drop the second floor living space from 96 degrees to 78 degrees without a single watt of electricity being spent on cooling. I have seen it measured with calibrated thermocouples by a friend of mine who teaches building science at a community college in Ohio, and he was so startled by the readings the first time he ran them that he drove back the next weekend with better equipment because he thought his cheap probes were lying to him. They were not lying. The second set of numbers came in within 2 degrees of the first. Now consider that the average American household spends between $2,400 and $3,600 per summer on air conditioning, depending on the state, the size of the home, and the rate the utility charges. In Texas, in Arizona, in Florida, in the deep parts of Georgia and Louisiana, the upper end of that range is conservative. I have viewers in Phoenix who have sent me July electric bills of $740 for a single month. Multiply that by the 4 months of real cooling season, and you are at nearly $3,000 before you have even bought groceries. The $7 device, installed correctly, with the supporting elements I just described, takes a meaningful bite out of that bill. Not the whole bill, I will not lie to you. The whole bill requires the full system, but a meaningful, measurable, bankable bite. I have a viewer in Tulsa named Marcus who installed the ridge vent and added 2 soffit vents in the spring of 2022. Total cost of materials, $41. Total time invested, 1 Saturday afternoon. And his July 2022 electric bill came in $218 lower than his July 2021 bill on a hotter month. He sent me both bills. I have them $218 in 1 month from $41 in materials. That is the kind of return on investment that the financial advisors on television will never tell you about because there is no commission in it for anybody. Let me give you a little more history, because I think the history is what makes this real. The Amish trace their building tradition through a man named Jacob Amann, who broke from the Swiss Mennonites in 1,693 inches, the Alsace region of what is now eastern France. Amann was a tailor by trade, not a builder, but the community that followed him into the New World carried with them a body of practical knowledge that had been refined across the high alpine farms of Switzerland, where winters are brutal and summers in the valleys can be surprisingly hot, and where every building had to do double duty as shelter against cold and refuge against heat. The Swiss chalet, with its deep overhanging eaves, its ventilated ridge, its stone foundation drawing coolness from the earth that is the direct ancestor of the Pennsylvania Amish farmhouse. When the first families arrived in William Penn's colony in the 1730s, they brought the chalet logic with them, and they adapted it to the climate of southeastern Pennsylvania, which is hotter and more humid than anything they had known in Europe. The adaptation took about 2 generations. By 1790, a recognizable Amish architectural vocabulary had emerged, and the ridge vent, the soffit intake, the central stair stack, and the cellar draw were all already standard features. Standard 235 years ago. While the rest of the colonies were still building English-style sealed boxes and dying of heat stroke in their attics, the Amish were already living in houses that breathed. And then in 1902, a man named Willis Carrier invented the first electrical air conditioner in Buffalo, New York. And within 50 years, the American building industry had collectively decided that the answer to summer heat was not architecture but appliances. We stopped designing houses to handle their climates. We started designing houses to be sealed against their climates, and then we bolted on machines to fight the climate inside the seal. The Amish watched all of this happen and did not change a thing. They kept their 7/8 of an inch. They kept their deep eaves. They kept their cellar vents and their transom windows and their ridge caps cut from copper or galvanized steel. They were called backward. They were called stubborn. They were called, in some of the more polite agricultural journals of the 1950s, an interesting anachronism. And now, in 2024, with electricity rates climbing in every state in the Union, with grid failures during heat waves in Texas and California killing people in their sealed homes because the machines failed and the houses could not breathe on their own, suddenly the anachronism looks like prophecy. There is a phrase the Amish use that I want you to carry with you. They say, "The old way is not old because it is behind us. The old way is old because it has lasted." Anything that has lasted 300 years has earned the right to be called wisdom. Anything that has lasted 30 years and requires a service contract and a refrigerant refill every spring has not earned that right yet. Now, before I close out, I want to give you 3 practical warnings, because I would rather you do this correctly than do it fast. Warning number 1, do not, under any circumstances, install a ridge vent without also opening the soffit intake. A ridge vent without soffit intake will actually pull conditioned air out of your living space through any tiny crack in the attic floor, and your electric bill will go up, not down. The intake is not optional. It is half the device. Warning number 2, if you live in a region with heavy snow load, the ridge cap dimensions change. You need a taller profile to prevent snow from blocking the gap, and you need an internal baffle to prevent powder snow from being sucked into the attic during winter storms. The Amish in northern Indiana and in upstate New York use a slightly different geometry than the Amish in Lancaster County for exactly this reason. Warning number 3, insects. A ridge vent without proper screening becomes an interstate highway for wasps, hornets, and in some regions, bats. The Amish solution is a strip of fine bronze mesh, never aluminum, because aluminum corrodes against copper flashing, set into the gap with a slight downward angle so debris falls out rather than collecting. Bronze mesh costs about $4 for a 10-foot strip at any hardware store that serves a serious rural community. Get the bronze. Skip the aluminum. Your future self will thank you. Walk outside tonight. Look at that ridge line. Measure 7/8 of an inch with your fingers and hold it up against the sky. That is the gap between the bill you are paying and the bill you could be paying. That is the difference between a box and a lung.